Um, for all of those who don't know me, my name is Susan Schoenberger. I'm the Director of Communications at Hartford Seminary. And we are thrilled to have this wonderful group with us for today's webinar with Dr. David Grafton. We have been doing these webinars for about a month now. We started to come up with some ideas right after we all went to online teaching and at home working in mid-March, and this is our 5th webinar. These were developed basically as a way to thank our community for everything they've done for us and to offer the expertise of our faculty and our staff at a very difficult time. And these webinars have been a real wonderful way for us to connect with our community and to the community beyond Hartford Seminary as well. So thank you all for attending. I just heard from someone that we have someone tuning in from Myanmar today. So that is wonderful. It's so great to see how widely we can actually send these messages and send this information out to people. So I'm just going to do a little housekeeping. Basically, all of you should be muted and should probably stay on mute until we get to the questions and answers. If we have a small enough group, we may be able to have people ask their questions live. If not, I may ask people to put their questions in the chat. And certainly you're welcome to put any questions in the chat as Dr. Grafton is doing his presentation, so that maybe if something occurs to you and you're worried you might forget about it later, just go ahead and put that in the chat and we will definitely moderate that and monitor. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Grafton and also congratulate him for his book, which is what we're really here to talk about today. It's a big deal when anybody publishes a book. So congrats to you, and we can't wait to hear what it's all about. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Susan. Susan, if the sound goes a little bit down, just let me know. Give me that high sign and I'll see what I can do. So yeah, thanks everybody. Just want to spend some time with you today talking about this book. So as Susan mentioned, we've been doing these webinars and many of them have been responding to our current situation, how to pastorally, how to respond for congregations and synagogues and during Ramadan in this unprecedented time. This is something completely different. Now we're moving into more academia and some teaching that we do here at the seminary and that I do. And I'm thankful because this book came out in 2019 in the fall, late November, and we were scheduled to have a book talk in the fall, and that got snowed out. So I thought, hey, let's try this virtually and see if we can't do the book talk this way, and maybe this will become a precedent for the future. So anyway, so I'd like to share with you about the book today. I would like to talk about why I came to write it, and then how I constructed the book, how I put it together. And then finally, so what? What does what I call an American biblical Orientalism mean, and why does it matter? So I have a PowerPoint I'm going to share with you, and I'll leave the PowerPoint up for the bulk of the presentation, and then we'll come back. I'll come back, and then we can have a Q&A, and Susan can moderate that. So let's start this. Okay. So this book, American Biblical Orientalism, it's about the American construction of the identity of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the 19th century. So the book is a spin-off of some previous research I did about a Bible translation in the 19th century that was done by a number of people, primarily Assyrian Boutros el-Bustani, his colleague and American missionary Eli Smith, and then their friend who was a man by the name of Edward Robinson, who was a New Testament professor at Union Seminary, in the 19th century. And as I wrote that book, I was fascinated by the particular international relationships that developed during this period. And I began to wonder about how these three people, who I call three dead white guys, how their relationships came together around primarily the writing of this translation of this Bible, but then Edward Robinson, who is on your right, and his particular research. So the story focuses primarily on Edward Robinson, who's got these beady little glasses off to the right, and his two colleagues, Eli Smith on the left and William Thompson, who is in the center. Those two were American missionaries serving in Beirut. Now, something about Edward Robinson. He was the premier North American biblical scholar of his day. He was known widely in Europe.
David, we lost your audio. David?
Everybody wave. Everybody wave. There we go.
For some reason, we lost your audio, David, just a minute or so ago. Sorry, everybody. This is what happens when you do something live.
All right.
Yes.
Am I back?
You're back.
Yay. Okay. Sorry about that. Now we'll get back to the screen. Okay. Okay. Let's get back to our three dead white guys. So Edward Robinson had in mind that he wanted to travel to the Holy Lands and what he called to do a scientific study of the geography of the Holy Lands. And so he became known as the father of biblical archaeology. What he wanted to do was he wanted to travel around to the various sites of the Bible and to look at the geography and there to prove that the Bible was factual based upon the geography that was there. Now, of course, Christians had been living in the Holy Lands for many, many years, and there were all kinds of churches and convents commemorating biblical sites and places. But Eli Robinson, as an evangelical, did not have any, he didn't believe in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions. And so he didn't view them as factual. He did not want to trust them. And this was very important because the most prominent Orthodox and Catholic site in the Holy Lands was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christians believe Jesus died, was buried, and raised. And people had been worshiping there for hundreds and hundreds of years. Eli Smith did not believe that this was the location of the burial of Jesus, primarily because of his reading of the Bible and the burial, Golgotha, taking place outside of the walls of Jerusalem. So he wanted to go and look for this himself. So he did not take any Orthodox or Catholic traditions at stock. or at face value. Rather, his theory was that he saw that the Hebrew names in the Bible were present in the continued, he says, in their continued Aramaean form long after the times of the New Testament, and maintained themselves in the mouths of the common people, and have thus lived upon the lips of the Arabs, whether Christians or Muslims, townsmen or Bedouin, even unto our own day, almost in the same form in which they had been transmitted to us in the Hebrew scriptures. In other words, Robinson wanted to use local Arab tradition to help him find actual biblical sites. And he developed a scheme by which he would read the Hebrew sites and try to transliterate them into Arabic. Now, Robinson, as a biblical scholar, knew Hebrew, Greek, French, German, and Latin, but the one thing that he didn't know was Arabic. So it was for this reason that he reached out to his former seminary classmate and good friend, Eli Smith. Eli Smith was the one who managed to help him travel around to these many sites, to speak with the local people, and in Arabic, engage them in conversation about the origins of these particular sites. Now, to back up a little bit in terms of my interest in this topic, that has to do with the whole premise of the words, sorry, let me go back, biblical Orientalism. My experience has been that for many Americans who go to the Holy Lands, they have one of two responses. They either have a dramatic, life-changing experience in which their engagement with the Holy Lands and the people was just an incredible, life-changing spiritual experience. Or they come away completely disillusioned with their experience. And here I'd like to read just a bit from my preface about an experience I had that actually led me to write the book. The preface begins this way. One of my seminary students had recently returned from a trip to Israel, Palestine. I was interested to learn about his experience. I knew that this particular student was extremely excited to be going to the Holy Lands, but that he was also a bit nervous because it was in the Middle East. When I asked about the experience, without hesitation, the student retorted that it was very disappointing. He followed with a litany of complaints that included several incidents where various local people had rudely intruded upon his spiritual experience and journey. And it was clear to me that for this American Christian, the pilgrimage had been ruined primarily because of the local people. So this is what led me to engage in this particular book called American Biblical Orientalism, primarily because throughout the centuries, many people, many Americans had traveled to the Orient, as it was called then, to the Holy Lands, and they also had these two kinds of experiences. William Thompson, a missionary who we'll meet in a few minutes, wrote the famous The Land in the Book, in which he describes this beautiful esoteric place in which he had an unbelievable spiritual encounter. The other person on the left, the more famous Mark Twain. Mark Twain went to the Holy Lands as a part of a long journey, and he had a very negative experience. And I'll introduce you to some of Mark Twain's responses. Incidentally, Mark Twain's travel to the Holy Lands, to Europe and the Holy Lands, became his best-selling book, which was called The Innocents Abroad. He made most of his money on this particular travel experience, and here you'll see it was a very negative one. Now, the book itself takes its title, Orientalism, from the famous work by Edward Said, Orientalism. Now, various people have critiqued Edward Said and used his particular framework. And I have a chapter in the book where I do talk about the pros and cons of his particular methodology or his view. But nevertheless, I use his word because what he means by Orientalism is this. He says, by Orientalism, it is a way of talking about or a discourse that not only creates, but maintains narratives. It creates structures and has authorities over people by the narratives that it creates about them. And in this case, Said is talking about how Westerners viewed the people of the Middle East as Orientals. And here he says Westerners constructed the image of the Orientals. The book is very famous and it has impacted virtually all kinds of academia and scholarship. But my interest was on his second book called Culture and Imperialism, where he uses the same idea. But in this book, Said focuses on Americans and American views. Here in Culture and Imperialism, he talks about the descriptions that Americans came to have of the Orient. Now, what was interesting for me is that Edward Said talks about the importance of the grand narratives or the novels that Americans wrote and how they constructed images of the Orientals. But the one genre that Said left out of his book was the Bible. Now, if you know anything about 19th century American culture, it is that the Bible was the primary book and the primary piece of literature that most Americans read. In fact, many Americans learned to read by using the Bible. And so it struck me as quite unusual that Said here was looking at how Americans viewed the Orient, and yet he skipped over how Americans use the Bible to describe the Orient. So this is what I call an American biblical Orientalism. That is that for Americans, the primary way in which they had described the Orient or the Holy Lands was through their images and stories of the Bible. So that is how I came to my term called an American biblical Orientalism. So let's look at how Edward Robinson constructed this narrative of an American biblical Orientalism. Now, Robinson was not only known for his famous travels to the Holy Lands, in which he wrote the book Biblical Researches in Palestine, which literally put him on the map in terms of his scholarship in Europe and the United States. But for Americans, he was primarily known for his editing of Bible dictionaries. Now, because most Americans, at least most Protestants, were reading the Bible regularly, they also had Bible dictionaries to help them interpret various terms.
David, we lost your, we lost your audio again.
All right.
Oh, seems to be back. Can you test it, David? I think it might be back.
Okay. Back on?
Yes.
There we go. All right. So Robinson's, let me catch up here. Robinson's Bible dictionaries were his most prominently read books. And I just want to read you a few of his entries from these Bible dictionaries to give you a sense of how he created an image of particular people in the Middle East. Let's take a simple entry, the tent. So somebody's reading the Bible and they read about Abraham in the tent, and they want to know a little bit about what is a tent in the Bible. So they go to the entry tent. And here they would read this. On the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt throughout their peregrinations until they obtained the promised land, they adopted the same kind of habitation. The Midianites, Philistines, Syrians, descendants of Ham, Hagarites, and Cushanites are mentioned in Scripture as living in tents. But the people most remarkable for this unsettled and wandering mode of life are the Arabs, who from the time of Ishmael to the present day have continued dwelling in tents. So, for the average American reader who was reading this, they get the impression that the people of the Bible were living in the same way and manner they had lived for thousands of years, and even in the 19th century. I'll come back to this in a minute. A second example might be from the entry of canticle or the canticles in the Bible dictionary. Here, Robinson is talking about the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, which is a book in the Old Testament. And so Robinson provides 4 images for his readers about a wedding, the wedding that is described in the Song of Songs. Here Robinson provides 4 images, 2 brides and 2 bridegrooms, as examples of people in what he calls Oriental dress. And they include 2 unnamed females in wedding attire and 2 unnamed males in attire. However, what's actually interesting is that one of the males on the top right hand is an image of the Shah of Persia from the 18th century. So what we have here are various images of individuals from a variety of different times put together in one frame to give the kind of image that no matter where you are in the Bible, or no matter what time you are in the Bible, everyone dresses the same and they all look the same. Now, one final example of Robinson's entry comes from his biblical researches. And here on his travels, he describes an event in which he and Eli Smith, his friend, were being hosted by a Greek Orthodox patron. And they were having dinner. And so as they were having dinner in 1838, he describes this event, which was then put into his Bible dictionary. Our youthful host now proposed in the genuine style of ancient Oriental hospitality that a servant should wash our feet. This took me by surprise, for I was not aware that the custom still existed here, nor does it indeed toward foreigners, though it is quite common among the natives. We gladly accepted the proposal, both for the sake of the refreshment and of the scriptural illustration. A female Nubian slave accordingly brought water, which she poured upon our feet over a large shallow basin of tinned copper. Kneeling before us and rubbing our feet with her hands and wiping them with a napkin, it was one of the most gratifying minor incidents of our whole journey. Now, Robinson is here recalling the story of the woman washing Jesus's feet in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7. He is, in essence, reliving this experience of Jesus, or at least how he imagined the experience. Now, what is interesting for me is that one would have expected that Robinson, who was a socially conservative Calvinist, would have been uncomfortable by having a strange woman touching his feet in public. And as a New England abolitionist, one would have hoped that he would have been appalled that a black slave would be performing such a task. However, his imagination of the ideal of experiencing what Jesus experienced took precedent over his current values and circumstances. The fact that he was being served by a black slave in such a manner was inconsequential to his experiencing the Bible. This is an example of what I call an American biblical Orientalism. Now let's move on to William Thompson, the other named dead white guy in this book, and another missionary. Now, Thompson is by far the most interesting and quirky character of this book. He went with Robinson on his second travels to guide him along the way, and then he had in mind to write his own book, which he called The Land and the Book. According to most estimates, William Thompson's book, The Land and the Book, was the most widely read book outside of the Bible by American Christians in the 19th century. In fact, even Mark Twain read it. And we'll come back to Mark Twain again. The Land and the Book. Now, this is a spiritual journey in which Thompson travels from Beirut to Jerusalem, and along the way, he describes biblical places and sites and the people along the way. And he then creates a narrative for his American readers of what the Bible lands and the Bible people are like. You can see here a portrayal of women grinding wheat at a common mill, which he indicates was a daily and normal event. Below this drawing or sketch, which was done by his son, are biblical passage that he provides from Matthew 24. For example, then there will be two in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken and one will be left. His descriptions and pictures of the people most clearly creates an image and expectation for his American readers that the real life people that he encounters are exactly like the people of the Bible more than 2,000 years ago, as if nothing has ever changed among the people, languages, and cultures of the Bible lands. In the other two figures here, or images, he provides pastoral images of the Orient, of Jenin, and an Arab camp. These exotic images become part of an overall un-American Orientalizing, that is, fixing and narrating the contemporary biblical characters of who they are, and more importantly, who they should be for their American readers. So that when people like Mark Twain and others traveled, this is what they expected to see, and they paid good money for it. The last and most grievous example of an American biblical Orientalism that I'm going to share with you today are images that Thompson provides of what he calls a Syrian gentleman and a Syrian lady. Now, he provides these images for his readers so that they will get an idea about what the local population looks like. Very exotic and very Oriental. These images of the man and woman come from his 1860 The Land and the Book. The problem is that these images are plagiarized directly from another book that was written by the British Orientalist Edward Lane and his famous book, The Manners and Customs of Modern Egyptians, from the 1830s. So when Thompson edits his book, he plagiarizes these images of Egyptians and puts them in his book, calling them Syrians. The point being that for the American readers, whether they were Syrians or Egyptians, whether they were from the 1830s or the 1860s, or when he finally published his second edition in the 1880s, some 50 years later, his readers saw the same people and the same style of dress and the same kind of people that they expected to see. Now, what's important about this period here in the 19th century is that in Syria and Egypt, between the 1830s and the 1880s, was a period of what we call the Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance. It was a time of extreme social, political, and literary development. The Nahda was a period of great change and transformation. Egypt, Syria, and Palestine were undergoing dramatic political, cultural, and economic changes. But for Americans reading their Bibles back in Cincinnati, Ohio, or Boston, Massachusetts, it didn't matter if you were reading it in the 1830s, the 1850s, or the 1880s. These people looked the same. And so these Bible people should be the same. That's why they were from the Bible land. Nothing ever changed. So what? What's the big deal about this? As I mentioned, lots of Americans traveled to the Holy Lands in the 19th century, thanks to the steamship and other forms of transportation. It became cheaper for Americans to travel to far places, and they did. One of them was Mark Twain. They came looking for adventure. They came looking for the Bible. And for those who were quite pious, they came because they were on a spiritual pilgrimage, like my student that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And they came looking for the Bible lands, and they wanted to experience the Bible people, irregardless of what was actually happening in the Middle East at the time. They simply wanted to experience the Bible people. So let me conclude with the words by Mark Twain from his book, Innocents Abroad, who had quite a negative experience in his travels. Actually, let me go back to that previous image, because if you watch this while you hear this, you might get more of an idea. Mark Twain was along on his trip with a number of other evangelical Christians. And Mark Twain took with him on the trip his Bible, which he was suspicious of. He took with him a copy of Edward Robinson's Biblical Researches in Palestine, and he took with him a copy of William Thompson's The Land and the Book. He had these three things with him as he traveled. He writes this toward the end of his travels. "It is 7 in the morning, and as we are in the country, the grass ought to be sparkling with dew, the flowers enriching the air with their fragrance, and the birds singing in the trees. But alas, there is no dew here, nor flowers, nor birds, nor trees. there is a plain and an unshaded lake, and beyond them some barren mountains. The tents are tumbling, the Arabs are quarreling like dogs and cats as usual. The campground is strewn with packages and bundles. The labor of packing upon the backs of the mules is progressing with great activity, and the horses are saddled with the umbrellas, and in 10 minutes we shall mount them up and be on our long way out, just as we were yesterday. For Twain, like others, the Bible Lands was an immense disappointment because he had with him images of what the Bible lands and the Bible people should be. And like the experience of my student that I mentioned, it didn't match up with their expectation, and so they were quite disappointed. For many Americans, they retreated back into their own Bibles and their own Bible dictionaries and recreated what they wanted for their own ideas and images of what the Bible lands should really be like. Let me conclude with the final paragraph in my book. The Bible lands were a disappointment compared to what they imagined of the Bible, stories that Robinson and Thompson that they had carried with them from their childhood. For many Americans, it was easy to accept that the degraded state of the Bible lands was due solely to the despotism of the Turk, the backwardness of the Muslim Arab, the superstition of the Eastern Christian, or the stubborn fanaticism of the Jews. Oriental Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike refused to accept the simple truth of the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah and the Savior. However, these 19th century evangelicals were certain that the Messiah's coming again would restore both the land and its people to their rightful role. And American evangelical piety could assist this restoration of truth through faithful preaching and gospel-centered living that represented truth, liberty, progress, and chosenness. End quote. Naturally, such views can do violence to indigenous peoples who have no voice of their own or identity of their own if they are not left to speak, if American pilgrims will not let them speak. So this is what I mean by the true ideal of an American biblical Orientalism, creating a narrative from the Bible based on what we imagine the lands and the people might look like and should look like and should be, regardless of when we experience them, 2,000 years ago or today. So hopefully I've piqued your curiosity of the book. If you are a Hartford Seminary student, you can get the book on the Digital Theological Library. You can access it there. It is available on Amazon. I have to warn you though, as a hardcover academic book, it's quite expensive. So if you want to wait for the paperback, that might be better. But go visit your local seminary library. I'm sure they'll have it. So why don't we stop now and take some questions.
Great. I'm seeing some people kind of raising a hand. So let's see if we can attempt to do some live questions. And if that doesn't work well, we'll resort to the chat. But I just saw, is it Ulker? Do you have a question? If you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask. Okay, we're not hearing you, so maybe put your question in the chat.
So there it is. It says, David, have you seen Westar's American Heretics, a new film out of Oklahoma. No, I haven't. So I'd be interested to see it.
Anybody else want to attempt to do a live question? Yes, Timur?
Yes, David, thank you.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? Yeah, good morning. So great, wonderful, and there's so much to talk about. The thing that strikes me, and it's not, it's kind of a common observation, but this phrase of how naturally that phrase came to Robinson, I think it was, ancient Oriental. So Oriental necessarily is ancient. And so can you comment more on that, and can you kind of, how common is that trope? What do you make of that trope?
Yeah,
and
it's
how
very
important is this observation to the rest of us?
It's very common. So when you read through his work, so Robinson kind of like most seminary professors straddled the worlds of academia and church life, and he was well known. He did his studies in Germany, and so he did really cut his teeth on 19th century German textual study. So he was right in the middle of that, some of the classical German textual studies on the New Testament. And he took from that some of these concepts of the ancient Orient, and he brings it back, and in an interesting American way, biblicizes it. He focuses on the Bible exclusively, and he just has this general idea that certainly the Bible is from time immemorial, right? And for him, it was literal. He was a biblical literalist, and so that's why he was going to the Holy Lands to try to prove all these sites existed. And so because these people lived there like they did for centuries, they were ancient. They were ancient people. And so my interest was, well, what about, for him, what about the people of the 19th century? They weren't ancient, they were his contemporaries. And certainly for example, his Orthodox host in Hebron was not an ancient person. He was a well-read, well-educated person who had slaves. So I was curious as to, how Robinson primarily was taking this concept from Europe that he had about the Orient, and he biblicized it.
So David, we have a question in the chat from Olker, who wasn't able to talk to us directly, but she's doing research on Frederick Church and was wondering why he brought back the dress of the local people and even wore them. Can she assume that he was influenced by his Bible dictionary?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so Frederick Church is amazing. He painted these images, and forgive me, I can't remember the style that he used. Susan, we had down at the Athenaeum in Hartford a Frederick Church exhibit, and I went down there and looked at those pictures, and they're very reminiscent of what David Roberts did, the Scottish painter, when he went to the Bible lands and did the same thing, same kind of genre, painting images of the landscape and then inserting the people in the corner of the landscape. So this becomes a common motif. It became very, very common for people, especially artists and people who were of means, to purchase clothing, slippers, robes, keffiyehs, and bring them back and to wear them. And there was even a couple of periods in American history in which it became popular for wealthy elites to dress up and to go Turk, if you will, to wear turbans and fezzes. In fact, some of the other literature talks, I don't get into this so much in my book, but talks about, you know, the Shriners and how the Shriners adopted this Orientalized view, and they adopted that for themselves in ways that they certainly don't even know about the symbols today. But so it was common that he would have brought this back, and Church was also reminiscent of other artists of the time who were painting these broad landscapes of the Orient, and the images in William Thompson's book, The Land in the Book, are of the Bible land. So I would encourage you to look at William Thompson's book, because he has some images there that his son painted that are very reminiscent of Church's works.
I think we can try one more live question here. Anne McClanahan, I think you had your hand up.
Oh,
You're good. I unmuted you.
okay, thank you. I get it builds on a question that I think from C.A. Home put on the chat a little earlier. I find it, the question that raises for me, being more of a 20th century American religious history person, is the degradation that people felt they experienced in the 19th century. To what extent do you think that has shaped 20th and 21st century views of, quote unquote, the Orient?
Do you mean American views, like, for example, American Protestant views of the Orient?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure this is answering your question directly, but I do think what prompted me to write the book is that, as someone who's lived in the Middle East and does research on communities in the Middle East and the history of the Middle East, I've often found Americans who come over, they have a wide variety of expectations that are already set in stone about what they want to experience. And for many of them, the people don't live up to their expectations. Here's a good example of that. If you take the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example, which if you've never been there, for many Christians, it is kind of the navel of the world. It is the center of the commemoration of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. But it is not very Protestant, and it is not very American. I mean, it has chapels of the Armenians, the Syrians, the Copts, the Catholics. It is everything that American Protestantism isn't. But it's been going on for thousands of years, and Christians have been going there to get sustenance. So many Americans will go, my experience is that many Americans will go to kind of view and witness this museum that doesn't really impact them at all. Rather, if you go down the road out the Damascus Gate, about a half a mile down the road, there's a place called Gordon's Tomb, which is a small little garden, which another 19th century evangelical found, and it is a first century Roman tomb. And they've reconstructed it to be kind of this garden. And so most Americans and most Protestants, they go to this garden tomb because that for them really is what John 21 feels like, you know, Mary in the garden and Jesus. And it's very quiet, and there's flowers that are put there, and it's very pastoral. But it's not the center of contemporary Christian activity. So I think I don't know if this is answering your question, but my point is that for many Americans, they disavow the contemporary or the current or the ongoing expression of faith, whether that's Christian, Jewish, or Muslim faith. and they already have in mind what they think it should be like, and they're going to do their best to recreate it. And as I argue in the book, that even does violence to the people.
David, there's one more question in the chat, and why don't we do that, and people can continue to ask questions in the chat. Was slavery not different in the Europe and US versus the Middle East?
Well, there's no question that slavery in the Americas, North America, the Caribbean, and South America, was very different than in Europe or the Middle East. There's no question about it. The plantation system in the Caribbean specifically, and then to some extent in North America, was unlike anything else around the world ever. The dehumanization of Africans and others. My point in the book is that Robinson, he was born in Connecticut, and he was a New England abolitionist. And he was a part of the Presbyterian Church's abolitionist movement when he was at Andover Seminary and then at Union Seminary. So he engaged in this whole endeavor of research, being born and raised an abolitionist. So it struck me that this encounter he had with a Nubian slave, that he would not have told his host that this was inappropriate, that this was not right, that this was against the humanity of this woman. And yet the experience that he had went straight to Luke 7, this biblical experience. For me, that was very jarring. And when I first started doing research on this book, I read a paper at a conference on North American Christianity, and I used this example. And everyone said, you know, they said, that has to be like your opening paragraph of the book because it's so stark that this abolitionist would be so blind that he wouldn't see what he professed while trying to experience the Bible. Well, I didn't lead with it in the book for whatever reason, but it is in there anyway.
So another question from Nasiba. You want to go ahead? Oh.
Actually did ask the slavery question of, was slavery not different in Europe and US versus the Middle East? I think the reason why I wanted to ask that was, I understand that you had given a description of the woman where it said that she was Nubian, but a lot of Middle Eastern people, I guess, like their look is also ethnically ambiguous. And from my understanding was that slavery wasn't just based on race. So I wasn't sure if that was also something that might have like made it seem a little different. I remember I had lived in the Middle East for almost 10 years. And I remember there was this concept of having maids or like a driver or I guess people who kind of just helped you around with things. It was such a foreign concept to a lot of foreigners who came to visit. But I think like when I came back to the States, like having an Uber driver or someone come over to your house to clean was very a foreign concept to me if they didn't live in your home. So I think when it comes to these words of like slavery and like the biblical context, looking back in history, I'm just trying to like understand how it might have looked completely in the Middle East, specifically in Palestine, in Jerusalem, because I don't know if that would also affect someone's perspective, especially an abolitionist.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that could be, I used the term Nubian was Robinson's term. So he writes in his journal and then uses that as an entry for the Bible dictionary about this Nubian slave. That's how he describes her. So we can assume then that she was African or dark skinned. But you're right that slavery was not racialized only for Africans. I mean, many people were enslaved in a variety of different ways. Susan, can I see this last question. Can I make a comment on that?
Yes, go ahead. And then I'm going to just do a little follow-up and we'll,
Yeah. So the final question is, wouldn't you say that just shows how they dehumanize the locals? So yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at is what Orientalizing is you already have an image in your mind of what people should be like. And if they're not like that, you're not going to be satisfied, or you're going to do anything you can to create that image for yourself. What I think is so astounding to me is that Robinson began this whole endeavor with his theory that in order to prove the Bible, he would go back and look at local Arab culture. And he would take the local Arab traditional names for places and locations and villages that Eli Smith had helped him with, and that he would use those linguistically to figure out the ancient Orient or the ancient Bible. So in other words, he starts with then local culture, but then by the end, by the time he publishes his book, eradicates the local Arab towns' names and reuses the biblical names, to the extent that new maps are drawn, Bible maps are drawn, where the Arab names are gone and the biblical names, the ancient biblical names, become what everybody's looking for. So when these American pilgrims come over, they're looking for the biblical names. They have no idea about the Arab names, and they could care less about it. So that was dehumanizing. So yeah, I think absolutely you're right in terms of what that meant for the local people. And ultimately why this matters is because we don't want to do this to others, right? We don't want to dehumanize. We want to let people speak for themselves and their own particular piety, their own particular view of culture, or their own identity.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was fascinating. I really learned a lot. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you spending an hour with us. I just want to throw out there that we have an amazing opportunity for our summer courses. We have made them half price in order to help people out at a really difficult time. And we, of course, have all of our 6 summer courses online this year. They start on May 18th and run through June 26th. We have some really topical courses. One of them is called Interfaith Leadership in Times of Crisis, developed specifically to address what we're all dealing with at this time. So please take a look at our website, heartsem.edu, and check out those courses, forward them to people you might think are interested. We really want to have a robust group, and we're already seeing those courses start to fill up. So that's been wonderful. I also want to let you know that we have recorded today's session, and we will be sending that out along with David's PowerPoint so that you can share that with anybody. You can go back and take a look at anything that you might have missed. And again, thank you so much for coming. We're also looking to do some more of these webinars, possibly after graduation, which is in a few weeks. So if you have some ideas for topics that you'd like to see addressed, go ahead and email them to me. You can find my email address on our website under the contact page. So thank you so much again, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.